Hi, welcome to Lubrication Reliability in the Time of COVID. This webinar series is sponsored by AMRI, MRG Laboratories, Delta P Reliability Services, and Fifth Order Industry. Today we're going to talk about establishing and deploying competency. My name is Mike Holloway. I have 35 years experience in research, product development, applications, analysis, reliability, and certification preparation. I have 11 certifications, a BA in philosophy, a BS in chemistry, a master's in polymer engineering, and as a PhD candidate in material science. I've authored 7 books, starting with spend analysis and specification development, on through to writing the Dictionary of Industrial Terms, both editions. I published 147 articles on how to rebuild Mercedes-Benz and 17 on how to work on Porsche engines. I hold a patent on bearing cleaning composition. I'm the president of Fifth Order Industry, and currently I'm working on a commissioned manuscript called Pivot, The Unexpected Consequences of COVID-19. My personal research involves research and testing neuroplastic techniques and the effects of competency development. Our session areas we're going to go into discussion will be how to go about developing competency, how to select the right content. There's various lessons and classes and seminars and webinars that we're going to look to take. And then how to effectively use that content going forward to increase your company's profitability, your own productivity, and to build for your future. Research from the RAND Corporation, U.S. News and World Report, and many professional societies have indicated that only a tenth of people that say they started a current role receiving any kind of adequate training. The majority of those people, 86.8%, definitely require training, and nearly a fifth of that workforce requires extensive training. And further research from the RAND Corporation found that just an initial investment of $1,500 training per employee can actually see an average of a 24% increase in a company's profitability for those who actually invested in training. In that study, more than 3,100 U.S. companies, a 10% increase in educational development produced almost a 9% gain in productivity. Now, one thing's for certain, no one ever regretted getting trained and having an education, but there's plenty of folks out there and companies that regret not training. We go about establishing and deploying competency. Let's explore the 5 W's and the H. Why? Why are we going to do this? Well, we're going to improve productivity. We want to do this to improve employee retention as well. When employees are trained and they feel competent, they're going to stick around longer. This relates to increased profitability for a company. And who would go about training and developing competency? Well, quite frankly, everyone. Everyone can do this. Now, we're going to delve into the different positions and content and so forth later on. We're going to try to figure out exactly who should be learning what for their particular job roles and going forward. That's exactly what we're going to explore. Now, where are we going to do this? Well, before, we used to be able to be trained on-site, off-site, maybe even online. Now, with the COVID-19 keeping a lot of folks home, we're going to have to do a lot more online than we ever did before. And when are we going to do this? Well, now, tomorrow, next week. And how are we going to do it? Well, quite frankly, we're just going to turn on and tune in. We go about developing competency. We have to understand our assets. Our assets being not only our machines, but our manpower, our materials, but also a methodology. In that, we're going to explore the various pillars of mastery. Now, every training session, every competency development plan, we'll capture 5 different pillars. The first being the function, understanding the function of the machine, the material, even the methodology and the manpower, the structure of it, the application environment, the various failure modes, and how to go about repairing and even providing a prevention plan so failure doesn't occur. So whatever we study, we want to be able to actually employ all of these pillars. And the process behavior, which we're going to engage in, will be something that, well, the armed forces uses to observe, to orient, to decide, and to act upon. Observing the situation, orientating our competency, deciding on what we're going to do and how we're going to go about doing it, and acting upon it. Now we're into the application environment. Here, we're going to explore some learning theories. This is typically a horrible type slide to put up because it's too complicated and you can't read it. My intent is to show you just how confusing it can be. And there are many theories on how which people learn. And not one is perfectly correct, and yet none are necessarily wrong either. It really comes down to a personal environment in which someone learns. Now, there's different types of learning styles. It's important to understand not only where you fit in, but where your team fits in as well. Lots of different types of training sessions are designed primarily around verbal and visual. Some on kinetic and verbal. That's where we actually use words or a strong point. And many of us do learn that way, by verbal communication. We call it auditory learning sometimes. Some of us do learn by visual as well. We can read something or see a picture of something and we'll remember it. There's also kinetic learners, and some training sessions do take advantage of kinetic learning, where you're actually doing a motion and seeing how a process works physically. Many of us are a combination of these things, both verbal, visual, and kinetic. And yet there's some special folks out there that are logical mathematical learners. It's easy for them. They understand the language of numbers or chemical symbols or even things along those lines. And that's how they can actually understand and learn. There's social learners, and those folks learn in packs and groups. While there is also solitary learners. Those are the ones who like to push themselves across in the corner and basically take it all onto themselves. And that's how they're able to understand and learn from that. And then there's also musical learners. Musical learners, I dare say that probably a lot of us are like this. This is how a lot of us learn the alphabet. And if, for those of you who remember Schoolhouse Rock, can learn the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and certain history lessons and so forth, and from Schoolhouse Rock, it was set to music. It's one way in which we can learn. A lot of different learning styles. And different types of learning systems will take advantage of all these styles, and it will gravitate towards one. You can have customized learning styles according to how you learn as well. Those are a little bit more advanced, a little bit more expensive. One thing we have to understand in our application environment is our generational workforce. We have 5 basic ones. We have the traditionalists. Those are the folks that are older than 70 years old. They grew up during the Great Depression and saw the various wars and attacks on the country. That was the birth of the unions, and there was a strong nationalism behind it. Then we have the baby boomers. Those are between 50 and 70-year-olds. They experienced the civil rights movement in Vietnam, feminism even, and first space travel. We also experienced assassinations. Then the Gen Xers. The advent of personal computers brought about the evolution of the internet, the video game generation. These were the latchkey kids, becoming a little bit more independent than the boomers. They grew up with MTV and cell phones. And then we have the millennials. The millennials between ages of 20 and 30. They grew up with September 11th attack and highly technically integrated. They saw the Berlin Wall crumble, and Columbine was something that burned into their collective. They experience daycare, and they have helicopter parents for the most part. Parents who are hovering over them, trying to make everything okay. They all receive participation trophies in sports and what have you. And then there's Generation Z, the 20-year-olds, yet to prove themselves. They're involved in interactive gaming, and every day they go through a weapons check when they go to school. They're a very green generation. They care about the environment. They care about the future. They have expansive technology. But one thing that they definitely have experienced ever since they were born is constant war. Our country's always been at war during their generation. But they've also embraced the LGBTs, XYZ community as well. Very engaging and accommodating and quite frankly open-minded. But they do have their lawnmower parents, much different than a helicopter parent. Their lawnmower parents are clearing their way for them to have an easy existence. Now, with this generational workforce, we're going to have to learn how to train them and also engage with them. And the traditionalists, well, they want to be respected and they have a lot to offer. A high commitment to quality. They have a high spirit and loyalty to learn. And they can learn technology if you give them a chance. The boomers, well, they like being involved and they provide great mentorship as well. They want to be respected. They deal with resistance by forming dual mentorships and partnerships. The Gen X's, very independent, very family-oriented. Many of them, though, they do mistrust institutions. They have little patience for policies and procedures. So by training a Gen Xer, it's going to be different than training a boomer or a traditionalist. They like to be treated like peers, regardless of how old you are, how young you are. If you let them know what you expect from them, they can get the work done. And then we have the millennials. And they are accused of being spoiled, and yet they are a very caring sort, if you will. They are skilled more than any in technology, that's for sure. They're going to need a little bit of coaching for tasks that go beyond their competency. Sometimes they don't realize just how maybe incompetent they could be. There's a lot of confidence there. They respect diversity and social responsibility, and they do their best when they're actually connected to something emotionally. Their incentive really derives from social engagement more so than even financial. And then there's the Gen Zs, the digital natives they're called. Their technology skills are the greatest strength. One of their greatest weaknesses, though, is communication. So if we train these folks are great at online learning, but put them in a classroom environment where we have to engage one-on-one or face-to-face, they don't do as well as the other generations. They're not used to that. It's something we have to keep in mind. But it's also something we're going to have to train them as well, because people do learn from people. They engage with people. They work for people, and they work with people. And that requires eye contact. It requires a personal connection. And Gen Zs are going to have to learn that. Now, Goethe wrote, the ancients said that animals are taught through their organs. Let me add to this, so are men, but they have the advantage of teaching the organs in return. Now, this is really kind of interesting in the fact that it has been proven that when you learn something, it does change your DNA. This is how instincts are passed on from generation to generation. It's really important to understand this, because when you learn something, you do develop a habit and it becomes encoded. And unless your DNA is then changed again, it is going to be with them. So it's really important to develop those strong habits first on. That way, we don't have to go through the added energy to try to change them later. When we first experience something, typically we establish a short-term memory. And short-term memories, well, they're very unstable and quite frankly can be very inaccurate. They can only linger for a few seconds up to an hour or two. And short-term memories can be extended through repetition, though, to a few hours or a couple days, but they still can remain unstable. A neural pathway has to be developed in order for these things to be ingrained. When we go about developing behavior, we have to understand that we're also looking to develop a culture. And culture is what most people do most of the time. But behaviors are what actually the people actually do. Now, if we're going to obtain the culture we want, we need to shape behaviors. We need to shape behaviors by defining, training short-term memories, and then repeating them over a long period of time to create the behavior. And the right habits do become the right culture. The process behavior to observe, orient, decide, and act. Well, that's something that's embraced by the armed forces, and it is so because it works. It's a good process behavior that we can bring in to industry as well. Developing that behavior, it does require training, repetition, continuous repetition. And quite frankly, it can be very boring, tedious, if you will, especially if you've ever had a child learning a new musical instrument. It can be torture, but it's absolutely required. Because if you don't do the right behavior continuously and encode into a neural pathway, you're not going to establish the right behavior. The ultimate goal is to make these habits behaviors, and then behaviors become part of the culture. Old habits are incredibly persistent. They're very difficult to erase. Anyone who's actually ever had a dog that has a bad habit, chances are you've spent a lot of energy trying to have that habit erased with a new habit. Well, people are the same way. People can and will revert to old habits when there's a greater payoff consequence, or they perceive that old habit as a better way of doing something than the new one that they're trying to establish as well. Often when we try to develop competencies in people, this is a roadblock that we come up against, something to take into consideration. Now, as leaders, we have to specify the right behaviors. You have to provide what is needed to enable those right behaviors as well. The resources and skills, but also those incentives. A lot of times, folks that are going to question the reason why they're going to do something, it's because their old habit has provided them a certain amount of reward in doing so. So we have to take that in consideration. We have to guide these right behaviors with positive and corrective feedback. Those of us who have actually done any time training animals realize that, especially when it comes to a dog, you don't train a dog over a coercive action. You don't beat on it to get a behavior ingrained and instilled in it. You also don't motivate an animal necessarily by feeding it treats. Dogs are social creatures and they love to be part of a community and pack. They love affirmation and affection. And if there's one thing a dog loves, it's playing. A lot of times you can train a dog by showing it a certain amount of attention through play and affection than you would ever do so by giving it a treat. A gentleman by the name of Edgar Dale had done some research back in '69. And essentially, he wanted to understand what actually brought about better learning. And what he found out is that 10% of what we read, we retain. We retain 20% of what we hear and 30% of what we see. 50% of what we see and hear, 70% of what we actually say, and 90% of what we say and do. Now, how can we utilize this research into developing our own competencies and putting forward our own training methodologies for that matter? Well, the first order is reading, where we actually get content and bone up on it before even we take a course, let's say. The second order is actually seeing it done, experiencing, perhaps a YouTube video, webinars, and so forth. The third order is engaging the senses. I'm going to explore that a little bit more as well, where we can actually start pulling in various different types of learning modalities. The fourth order is engaging the environment, a kinetic learning environment we're actually utilizing. And the fifth order is implementing the mastery, being the mentor. Now, one way to develop competency that we discussed was to go about reading and hearing and listening and taking classes. And often we're tested on these things through a multiple choice exam or a fill in the blank. We're developing our mastery through recall and recognition. And typically that comes from visual and auditory. The next level, the second order, is actually seeing it done. We're learning the Pythagorean theorem as an example here. We actually take a look at the diagram, see the equation. Maybe we hear it actually worked out for us. We go about solving a problem with that particular equation. And maybe it isn't until years later that we actually apply it. We do this through spaced repetition. Here, when we actually begin developing competency on a higher level, we're engaging multiple senses. A great example of this would be learning how to drive. We've engaged our sight, our sounds, how it feels when we hit the go pedal, the accelerator, and the brake for that matter. One way in which we're assessed our competency in that third order is through a practical exam. If you ever attended vocational school and the instructor pulled apart an engine and you had to rebuild it, he had a checklist that he ticked off or she ticked off. Same thing could happen in an anatomy and physiology class when you took maybe in school, where you had to dissect an animal and identify all the different systems within that animal. We're actually getting in there on a kinetic level, physically doing something, explaining it. Another way is to actually leverage similar experience. We call these things pattern hooks. An example would be a flight simulator, where you're putting yourself in a similar surroundings, circumstances. You can learn like that. Actually, there's a lot going on now with virtual reality and augmented reality. It's a wonderful way to actually teach and learn and so forth and so have you. And actually, it's a very inexpensive way. In this case, if we look at this, the flight simulator, it's far more expensive and quite frankly more dangerous to learn on an aircraft than it would be a flight simulator. After we've gone through the various orders of trying to develop our competency, from understanding by reading and by hearing and by seeing and by doing, now it's time to actually start achieving competency. Here, you take on student to master mentorship relationships. When you take an apprentice under your wing and start shepherding them through their career, not only does it help them, it helps you, and everyone benefits. Now we're in a situation where many of us are home and we have the opportunity to develop our competencies and actually develop others' competencies. I put together just a suggested curriculum for lubrication and reliability. We're going to go into each one of these parts a little bit deeper, understand how it can actually be utilized. Now, before we get into the curriculum and what have you, let's keep in mind the various pillars of this mastery. All our training, everything we read, do, and say, and think about, and try to implement to our apprentices and so forth, let's keep some 5 things in mind. First of which, the function, the content that we're exploring. What's the function of these various things, from gears to greases to lubricants to analysis? What's it supposed to do? And then make sure that not only do you embrace it, but your apprentices embrace the idea of the structure. What is this thing made of? What is it designed to do? What's its application environment? How is it going to be used? What are the various failure modes associated with this? The failure modes of not only the material and machine, but also of the methodology and the manpower too. How does it fail? Because if we can understand how it fails and even why, we can put forward a repair and prevention plan on how to fix it and how to actually stop it or at least slow it down from failing. These are the pillars of mastery, and this is the stuff that all content should be geared around, whether you're learning how to implement grease analysis or lubrication management and inventory or even inline oil analysis. Now in phase 1, we look at things like reactive and repair maintenance, replacement maintenance, also known as preventive maintenance, predictive maintenance, proactive maintenance, operator-based maintenance, failure mode effect analysis, and KPIs. Phase 1 doesn't even start touching upon lubrication or machines or anything else yet. Right now, we're establishing a true foundation, the strategy, the way in which we're going to go about the function, structure, application, failure mode, and repair and prevention plans. This is beginning. Phase 2. This is where we're going to start exploring the devices, the gears, the bearings, the hydraulics, engines and compressors, chains, maybe wire, rope, and cable. This is going to be an integral device component within our industry. Maybe pneumatics, seals and gaskets, filters and breathers, and even solvents and cleaners. These things are going to be integral in understanding going forward in phase 3, 4, and 5. Now we have phase 3, where we're actually going to start looking at the lubricant fundamentals, friction wear, and the various lubrication regimes, lubricant chemistry, base oils and additives, the properties of these lubricants, grease, gear and transmission oil, hydraulic fluids and engine oils, and industrial oils, be it compressor oils or turbine oils or way oils and so forth, chain, cable, and wire rope lubricants. All these things that we're going to have to take a better understanding of going forward. And once again, exploring not only the function, but the structure, their application environment, their failure modes, and repair and prevention plans associated with these as well. And then we have phase 4, where we started taking this and looking at the application. For instance, grease application, oil application, lubricant storage, lubrication routes, inspections, and the overall program management. And then finally, in phase 5, we have tribology, the study of friction, wear, and lubrication. We have performance tests, different than oil analysis. These are the things that an oil lubricant is going to be tested for on the certificate of analysis or the technical data sheet, how these things are going to perform. We're going to analyze wear and understand contamination and condition analysis. In phase 5, we're going to start understanding a better way to take oil samples and interpret data. And then how we're going to go about integrating that data and that information on our overall reliability plan. Now, there are various professional certifications offered by different types of societies. Many of you have the CLS, which is from the Society of Tribologists and Lubrication Engineers, and some of you have the MLE, Machinery and Lubrication Engineer, and that's offered by the International Council for Machinery and Lubrication. Now these folks, they administer the exams. You can go on and take various types of classes to prepare yourself for these, but you also have to have some experience as well. Now these two different types of certifications, they're really geared for several different types: lubrication engineers, machinery engineers, reliability engineers, maintenance managers and supervisors, reliability professionals, and even lubrication technicians. Now mind you, these are higher end certifications, and they do require a lot of study and preparation, but they also require experience on the job. There's other certifications offered up by ICML and STLE as well. Some reliability and professionals. Think about the level 1, 2, and 3 of the machinery lubrication analyst, and the MLA. They look at lubrication in theory and so forth in application, but they really do focus on quite a bit of analysis, interpretation, sampling, and so forth. Obviously, the levels, the higher the level, the deeper they delve into the content. Lubrication technicians are suggested that they should probably look to a level 1 MLA, but also the MLT, the level 1 and 2 there, the machinery lubrication technician. Don't spend as much time in the analysis world, but they do get into the lubrication management and application. And there's even the LLA1, the lubricant analyst. Those are typically the folks that are in the laboratories, the technicians and so forth, but it's also very important for them to understand the world of lubrication, application, and management as well. And then mechanics and craftsmen are always suggested to take the MLT1. And finally, general managers and supervisors. Well, they're not exempt either. It's important for them to understand. And it's also suggested that they even achieve the MLA1, where not only are they understanding lubrication fundamentals, but also embracing the concept of analysis and how it can actually influence their overall reliability entitlement. Now, this gets into a little bit of detail, actually, what's covered in these various certifications. It gets quite lengthy. You can actually see it really does get broken out according to materials and methods. Any course that you take is going to focus on these depending upon what certification preparation class. And you actually see where there's a certain amount of multiple X's. That's where they spend the extra time. You also notice the typical hours of one of these classes, anywhere from 16, all the way up to 40 hours. It's also suggested the year's work experience recommended prior to that exam. Level 1s, typically you have to have at least a year experience on the job. And level 2, 2 or more. And level 3, where you go into a much deeper dive, 3+ years. For a CLS or an MLE, typically 3 to 5 years experience at a minimum, I would suggest. Now, it used to be where we could actually go out and get competency by taking on-site classes, both internally generated by your human resources department, your engineering departments, whatever. Maybe the vendors would come in and provide a lunch and learn, or perhaps you'd actually pay for a course. You might have to go off-site and take a class. You take classes over at conferences and symposiums and seminars. You could also engage in webinars, both internally generated and vendor paid. And also, you can take online classes, degrees, and self-study. Learn from your peers and your mentors. This is how we always used to develop our competencies. Now, it's a little bit different. Primarily, we're looking at online, webinars, internally generated, perhaps external, much like we're experiencing today. Online classes. You can even take degrees online. And obviously, you can self-study with books and even YouTube. It's now a different world, but it's one that we have to actually live in for the time being. Now, how do we go about implementing the content that we've mastered? Here's a picture of a Martin B-26 bomber from the Allied forces in World War II. Those red dots represent bullet holes as those planes would come back. The challenge was how to figure out how to reinforce that aircraft. But we had weight restrictions. So you can only use a certain amount of metal or what have you to reinforce that aircraft. The question is, where would you put your energy, time, resources into that? It's absolutely no different than what a maintenance reliability engineering team is going to face as well. You only have a certain amount of resources and energy. Where are you going to apply that? In this particular picture, I'll challenge you with choosing where you would do it. Would you do it where it's right behind the cockpit, on the wingtips, maybe on the tail wing? Where would you reinforce? Well, quite frankly, you wouldn't. Because you see, these are the planes that came back. Those bullet holes were inconsequential. They didn't bring the plane back or down. The plane came back. The thing of the matter is that the cockpit and the engines and even the dome gunner ball, that was left susceptible. The planes that probably crashed sustained damage to that part. Those planes didn't come back. And I bring this up as an example because sometimes we look at the obvious and don't necessarily look at a pragmatic view of it. Now, how would you assess the competency for this? Manual transmission. Well, you go about asking, how does it work? Have it explained. What is it made of? What's the alloys? Tell me about the gears. Tell me about the clutching mechanism. How is it actually used? What's the application? How would you go about fixing it if it broke? Or there's something wrong with the lubricant? How would you go about extending its life? These are the things that we can actually have as a foundation to establish our competency and eventual mastery of this. Now, how would we go about establishing and deploying competency? Well, we ask, we answer, and we master. The function, the structure, the application, the environment, failure modes, your repair, and prevention. Now, as we set up going on trying to establish our competency with ourselves and our team, the first things we should really start to do and understand is to set our goals. We want to target different areas of our asset reliability management, be it equipment, lubrication, or maintenance. The equipment management, we're looking to probably increase our equipment reliability, extend its life, increase its production efficiency, maybe even increase the equipment resale value. With lubrication management, well, maybe we want to reduce our lubrication costs and establish maybe optimum drain intervals. Perhaps we want to consolidate product inventory, maybe transition to new product formulations. And in maintenance management, perhaps we want to reduce maintenance costs, avoid catastrophic failures, reduce our downtimes, provide some sort of backup for warranty claims, and even schedule maintenance more effectively and efficiently. All these things can be part of the goals of why we're going to develop our competencies. Once we have our goals understood, we're going to want to define some measurables around those goals. Perhaps we want to correlate our equipment reliability to oil or grease analysis data. Looking at wear metals and contaminants versus work environment and even equipment designs. Maybe we want to establish a root cause, those limits and optimum lubricant performance parameters, understanding contaminants and the overall lubricant properties and how they're performing and how they're actually establishing a higher reliability entitlement for our assets. As we're developing our competencies and we've set upon our goals and starting to understand how we can actually go about measuring these things, we want to figure out how the program is actually performing, establishing your KPIs, your key performance indicators. These things are going to be what we're going to use to measure. There's two types, there's logistical and there's data mining. And logistical, an example of that might be trying to understand how to measure time on our oil or time on our grease longevity or our bearing longevity. Or perhaps we want to take out the turnaround time for our analysis. In data mining, maybe we're looking at property comparisons, looking at wear and contamination, oil condition comparisons, component reliability comparisons. Now, how do we go about establishing the KPIs? Well, if you haven't done it before, they're actually just 5 steps. We're going to look at the 5 steps of establishing our KPIs. The first of which is we establish our goals and objectives. Now here we want to start small. And small wins create a buy-in. We want to expand it incrementally. We don't take on too much too quickly. So if we're looking to implement a competency development program, don't look to try to have everybody become MLEs and CLSs. We want to just start small. We want to communicate. The management should know what is being monitored and how it's being monitored, prevent any kind of blame or unexpected failures. The second of which is establishing some critical success factors from these goals and objectives. Those CSFs, they're always combine 2 elements, a measurable activity and a specific time frame. I'll give you an example. Let's say we want to increase our equipment reliability and availability by 25% over the next 12 months. Or we want to decrease our engine overhauls by 20% over the next 12 months. Next, we want to establish our KPIs from our CSFs. All these key performance indices are metrics, but not all metrics are KPIs. It's a little confusing, but the KPIs are calculated measures, and they quantify the CSFs and enable a measurement of that strategy. They're always calculations of measures which are determined. An example would be a percentage. Perhaps a percentage of viscosity flags compared to last month. Why is viscosity trending up or down? And maybe the goal, obviously, prior to that would be to try to capture and make sure it doesn't. Or perhaps we want to look at the ratio of wear metals compared to last month. Or for that matter, failures. Next, we want to collect and measure. We want to measure, say, the lowest level of detail in that methodology. Now, raw numbers in and of themselves have limited usefulness, but ultimately we need to be related to each other in order to extract the most meaningful information possible. And finally, we want to calculate the metrics from these measures. These metrics are calculations of measures and are always expressed in ratios or averages, rates, or percentages. And establishing KPIs to measure objectives, that provides us a tangible and concrete evidence going forward and being on the right track. We're needing to make changes to improve our results. When we first start out, we have very little experience. Often our confidence is very high. We think we know it all. You know, it doesn't really occur to us until many years into our experiences that we really don't know a whole lot. And it seems as though the more we live, the less we figure out we know. But if you put in enough time, get enough gray hair and bleed a little bit more, and you put in the days, weeks, months, years, and decades, really focusing on a particular type of content and becoming a content expert, your confidence starts to go up, but it never does achieve the level of confidence you had when you first started out. This is called the Dunning-Kruger effect, where the unskilled and unaware have difficulties recognizing one's own incompetence. And this could be really translated to many things going on right now. And some of the experiences you may actually have with your team, or maybe even yourself. So what now? Now that we've spent close to an hour going through how to develop competency and perhaps what we should actually be looking to study and so forth and so on, what do? Well, first of all, like we said, we're going to set our goals. Figure out what you want to do for yourself and your team. Then establish your plan. Set this thing into motion. You're going to have to line up your resources, If you don't have resources, it can get rather frustrating over time. Now, establish your incentives. What's your personal incentive? What's your team's incentive? Remember, folks are incentivized through several different ways: personally, socially, financially. And then let's go about developing our competency. We've got great resources here. We've heard some amazing talks all week, and we certainly do look forward to going forward and helping you out developing these competencies. We all have our various areas of expertise. Mike talked about lubrication management, and Rich talked about grease and grease analysis, and Matt talked about oil condition monitoring, both inline and offline. And I'm here to help you figure out how to pull it all together and develop competencies for your team, both online, on-site, webinars, whatever it's going to take. I want to thank you very much for spending the past hour with me. And please, right after this slide, there's going to be a quick question session. It's only going to take you about 13 seconds to fill that thing out. Feel free to contact me directly if you want to discuss any of these ideas any further. I'd love to be able to come on board and help you develop your own competency and your team's competency going forward. And I can be reached at Holloway at fifthorderindustry.com or my website, fifthorderindustry.com, or you can call me directly. Text me, 214-450-7864. Thank you so much, and I really do look forward to hearing from you.